Welcome to Jesuitical, a podcast from American Media for saints and sinners. You can join us each week for honest conversations about the Catholic Church and our world today, sometimes over drinks. I'm Ashley McKinless, and I'm joined today by Father Sam Sawyer, the editor-in-chief of American Magazine. Welcome, Sam.
Good to be here.
Great to have you. And today we're having a really important conversation with David French, who's joining us from Chicago instead of his native Nashville. David is a former attorney and Army lawyer who served in Iraq in 2007 as a judge advocate. He's also a political commentator and currently serves as an opinion columnist at the New York Times. Welcome to Jesuitical, David.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
David, we're speaking to you at what feels like something of a turning point, although I suppose one in a series of turning points for the country. So today, we're recently coming off the events in Minneapolis, which we'll get to in more detail later. A little bit farther back than that, the Trump administration's operation in Venezuela, threats against NATO allies, and it's still January. We're less than 1 month into this year.
Don't remind me. Please don't remind me. It's still January.
So in that context, but really also looking at the course of the last 10 years or so, we wanted to talk to you today about the state of Christianity in the United States and what a healthy Christianity looks like and might be able to do in the age of Trump. So nothing contentious, nothing complicated, very easy today.
Oh, something that simple. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm ready.
Yeah, but before we get to your analysis on that, I wanted to kind of situate you for our listeners in both the political landscape and the religious landscape. So you're at the New York Times now, but I'm old enough to have read you in the National Review, a conservative magazine, and the Dispatch, which is kind of a post-Trump conservative media group. So maybe take us back to 2015 and say where you were in terms of Republican politics and evangelical Christianity before both took pretty sharp turns with the arrival of Trump on the scene.
I would describe myself in 2015 as not just a citizen in good standing in the conservative legal movement, but like in excellent standing in the conservative legal movement. I was a pro-life attorney who also was a religious liberty and free speech attorney. I had been president of FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Then it was called the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. I had run litigation groups that were defending many times Christian student organizations on campus. I had multiple lawsuits. For example, I filed on behalf of the Roman Catholic Foundation in the University of Wisconsin-Madison against the University of Wisconsin, represented a number of Protestant religious groups as well, Jewish groups, Muslim groups. So basically, I was a civil liberties attorney within the conservative legal movement. And also, I was a lifelong Republican. I had come of age. I was born in 1969, and I came of age during the Reagan era. And so I considered myself a Reagan-Bush Republican. I was a 2012 delegate to the Republican National Convention for Mitt Romney. So very much in the conservative legal movement, very much in the conservative movement more broadly. And then I joined National Review in May of 2015. I left the full-time practice of law. I had been a litigator for 21 years, both a JAG lawyer in the Army, but in my civilian life, a constitutional lawyer. And I'd been writing more and more and more about my work and finally just decided to make the plunge and shift over to being a journalist full-time. And that was May of 2015. And I thought I was entering one world. And then in June of 2015, Trump comes down the escalator and really just everything changes. And it has, at this point, I have not been a Republican since 2016. I'm not a Democrat either. I consider myself an independent conservative. But I have just had a front row seat to just the remarkable seismic political, ideological changes our nation has been going through. And it literally started 1 month after I started being a journalist.
And what about your faith? You're an evangelical Christian, and that
Yes.
also has been affected, or, you're not your faith per
Yes.
se, but your belonging to a specific church has been affected by Trump.
I think that a good way to put it is that in 2015, I was not just welcome in basically any evangelical church, but very enthusiastically welcomed. I would speak at a lot of churches. I would speak at Christian conferences. I had been defending Christian student groups so frequently for so long that I think it's fair to say that by the time I jumped ship over into journalism, I had sued more universities on constitutional grounds than maybe any other lawyer in America.
Hmm.
It's possible I mean, it was that frequent, and also including my pro-life legal work. So I was um, very appreciated in evangelical circles. And so when I started supporting, or when I said very early on that I was not going to support Donald Trump, and then turned that into I'm never supporting Donald Trump. So he went from sort of my last option in the Republican primary to I'm just not an option at all. The more I saw him, I did not expect that to create any real rupture in my church. I had been going to church more than once a week my whole life. I grew up in a evangelical family, going to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night, and then I'd also have youth group on top of that. So I grew up 4 days a week in some kind, or 4 times a week in some kind of Christian activity. Went to a Christian college, was a member of the law school Christian fellowship in law school, and at no point in mid 2016 or early 2016, when everything is really building to a head, did I think this is going to cause a rupture or a breach in my relationship with the church. But oh my gosh, was I wrong? Oh my goodness. Not everybody, but a significant number of people took my decision to oppose Donald Trump as really a sign that I was backsliding, that I was moving in a heretical direction. I've been called everything from a wolf to a heretic. There's been petitions that have circulated against me in the evangelical church. And I'm still pro life. I still support religious liberty. I have never supported Donald Trump. And I never anticipated the furious backlash that would result from that.
Mm. Sam, I'm curious if you had any experiences of that in the early Trump years, or sense of politics intruding into Catholic life in a new way.
Well, I mean, not, I think, to the degree that David has experienced. I also want to mention for our readers, and I'm sure we can put a link in the show notes, that David has written very movingly about how this experience developed in your life and the life of your family.
It wasn't just nasty comments online. This was
No.
in your church,
Right.
being accosted.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, you would have situations where people would confront me at communion table. So I'm trying to receive communion and I'm being confronted over politics. People would very aggressively confront my wife. People would very aggressively confront my children. Elders would get very aggressive. In one church that I attended, I found myself disinvited from Christian gatherings where they would refuse to let me speak. And then in the online world, some of this was from just pure white nationalists, but some of it was from from Christian nationalist world. You'd have threats, acts of intimidation, grotesque racism directed against my youngest daughter, who's adopted from Ethiopia. Yeah. So when I say it was horrible, I'm not, and it still continues in many ways. So when I say it was horrible, it's not just that people were mad at me. Look, if you're a columnist, you're going to be used to that. It's that people were trying to destroy my reputation, destroy my career, intimidate me into silence. It was and is in many ways horrific.
So, David, what I remember in the 2016 era from the Catholic perspective is that there was this. I mean, even though certainly the Catholic Church never officially taught that you have to vote for Trump or else, but a lot of Catholics took that position, either implicitly or in many cases explicitly. And it was this very sort of utilitarian consequentialist logic of, you have to vote for Trump because otherwise we're going to lose the Supreme Court for a generation and there will never be any hope of overturning Roe v. Wade. And so I'm wondering if you see, was it a similar mechanism operating in the evangelical world that led to that sort of stark, if you're not for Trump, you can't possibly be Christian? Or was there something else going on as well?
Yeah, there's a lot of that. So I would say what's different about the evangelical world and the Catholic world is the Catholic world is far, far more ideologically diverse than the evangelical world. So if you're going to look at the Catholic vote over the course of these last many cycles, Catholic voters are truly swing voters. So You will have cohorts of very strong progressives in the Catholic Church. You'll have very strong conservatives. But the evangelical church is a different culture entirely in the sense that it's a monoculture. So it's more than 80% we're going to support Donald Trump and did support Donald Trump. And so what that means is, in a way that I think a lot of people don't fully grasp, being a Republican is part of the core fabric of evangelical culture. It's sort of like one of the things that you just do, it just comes along with being an evangelical, like listening to Hillsong worship music or, having a Micah 6:8 painting on your wall. You're a Republican too. And there's some interesting research that has shown that alone among all major religious groups in the United States, evangelicals perfectly align ideologically with the Republican Party. Ryan Burge, who's the probably the foremost statistician of religion in the United States, has said, look, here's the way to think of it. Republicans are white evangelicals and white evangelicals are Republicans. And that creates a monoculture.
No, I was just going to say that made sense when it was President George Bush, who was a white evangelical and a Republican and kind of embodied a lot of those values. It's a lot harder for me to square from the outside with a figure like Donald Trump, who could not more disembody the Christian values. So what was it about the evangelical church and parts of the Catholic Church, apart from the abortion issue, that made them so easily reconcilable to this man?
Yeah, so there's a few things happening at once here. This is a complicated answer to your question. So, number one, I think it's important to remember, or important to know, that at least in the evangelical world, a lot of people talk about abortion and they vote about immigration. And there's an interesting statistical analysis done of evangelical votes. Again, this is relying on a lot of Ryan Burge's work that showed that immigration was actually more salient to evangelicals than abortion. The way I would say it is, they were voting for immigration restrictions, but they were using abortion to sort of punish dissenters. So what's really getting them out of bed in the morning is the immigration restrictionism. But then when you depart from that, when you have real problems with that, then they flip around and it's about abortion.
There's actually some similar polling indicators for that in the Catholic vote in 2024 from our colleagues at the National Catholic Reporter, that Catholics motivated to vote for Trump were voting more about immigration than anything else. And actually, in the contrary, that Catholics motivated to vote for Harris were voting more about abortion than anything else. So in both cases, like voting against the church's teaching in a profound way.
That's fascinating. That's absolutely fascinating, because I had made the point that you can reverse Roe v. Wade, but if the pro-life movement loses a posture of love, of loving your neighbor, loses a posture of caring for mother and child, is seen to be on the side of an extraordinarily hateful and aggressively punitive man like Donald Trump, that there would be long-term ramifications, and even the overturning of Roe v. Wade would be winning a very significant legal battle, but maybe on the process of losing the even more significant cultural struggle to respect life from conception to natural death. And that has borne out. The abortion rate ratio, numbers of abortions have been decreasing since the early Reagan years. So they spiked dramatically after Roe v. Wade, and then they've been steadily decreasing to such an extent that by the time Barack Obama left office at the very beginning of 2017, there were more than 300,000 fewer abortions in the United States than when Barack Obama was sworn in. And this was with a pro-choice president. So culturally, legally, America was moving away from abortion to such an extent that by 2017, the abortion rate was lower than it was before Roe v. Wade was decided, which is mind-blowing. But then, right after Trump gets into office, the abortion rate reverses. It starts to go up. It goes up before Dobbs. It even goes up after Dobbs, to the point where abortion is increasing again in the United States in this Trump era. And so I was very, very worried about this. And then I was also worried that the pro-life movement would compromise substantially to stay in Trump's good graces, because it was quite obvious Trump had no particular convictional attachment to the pro-life cause. It was very instrumental. But then as it became clear that if you dissent from Donald Trump, that you are cast out of your community, then it became very predictable that the pro-life movement would start to conform to MAGA. And so then by 2024, the Republican Party removes the call for a human life amendment from the platform. It removes its pro-life language. It becomes a modified version of pro-choice. Well, it's just up to the states, whatever the states choose, which is a form of a pro-choice position. And the pro-life movement didn't just stay lockstep behind Trump. They continued to shame anyone who dissented from voting for Trump. And then now they're just utterly impotent as the administration has allowed the abortion pill to flow across the country, that is approved generic versions of the abortion pill, that it is now waffling on the Hyde Amendment. I mean, the pro-life movement is essentially a coalition of invertebrates at this point, because they have been the political pro-life movement, because they've been completely co-opted by this colossal, titanic MAGA cultural force, in which if you jump off that train, you will. It's really hard to describe the social consequences to you in right-wing circles if you strongly come out against Donald Trump. And it was predictable, it was predicted, and here we are.
I think that's a great description and a damning one. I mean, I remember hoping and writing about this hope after Dobbs, that the pro-life movement wouldn't be captive in quite the same way, or at least, like the game theory version of the pro-life movement's political captivity to the Republican Party would be different. But it's been so sad to see that most of the political pro-life movement has remained captive to the Republicans, rather than trying to build any kind of broader pro-life cultural change to support any kind of eventual legal gains that are possible in the post-Dobbs era.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, right after Dobbs was decided, I wrote a piece that a lot of people got very angry at. And it was essentially, the right decision has landed on the wrong right. In other words, I supported the Dobbs decision, but it landed in a cultural moment where the right, the pro-life right, was in the grips of really a xenophobic, bigoted, hateful movement they were attached politically to this xenophobic, hateful, bigoted, pugilistic, vicious, malicious political movement. And look, I'm sorry, malice and hatred are incompatible with the pro-life ethic. And then also at the same time, in a weird way, the Republican Party is a coalition of evangelicals and libertines. And so if you look at sort of the Trump ethos, the Mar-a-Lago ethos, it is very hedonistic. The Republican Party and right-wing gatherings have become notoriously hedonistic. And libertinism and hedonism are incompatible with a pro-life ethic. And so here you have a pro-life movement that's kind of attached itself to a movement that at its core is hedonistic, libertine, hateful, and godless. And when you do that, you cannot possibly expect a culture of life to break out. You cannot possibly be surprised when more people default towards that hedonism and libertinism. And yet here we are. And look, there are some voices, friends of mine who are standing there going, no, this is wrong. Stop. And there are some who will do an occasional mildly disappointed tweet, that keeps them in the tent, but signals to people that I'm not really happy about this. But overall, I mean, look, even beginning in 2018, 2019, if you were dissenting from Donald Trump, you were going to be disinvited to pro-life gatherings. I mean, you were going to be not welcome. And so I know that firsthand. I mean, this is something that happened to me. They have bought in so fully And the culture of MAGA is so intolerant for any internal disagreement that it feels like they're just along for the ride at this point.
And in the wake of the MAGA takeover of the Republican Party, you've gotten a couple of responses from conservatives. One is, I didn't leave the party left me. I still have the same
Right.
values. There are others who are like, no, I'm just a Democrat now.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to see that happen. But I'm curious, I assume you're more in the former camp, but I wonder if there's anything from the Trump years that have shifted your views on any political issues, maybe immigration, maybe something else.
Well, that's a really good question. I would say, the area in which over the last 10 years I have had the most eye-opening experiences would be in the categories of race and policing, and including some of the things that we're seeing play out in Minneapolis, that which we can certainly talk about. And so and part of this is um, related to just taking a very close look at these issues, a closer look than I'd taken in years past, and then also personal experience, just seeing the gross racism directed at my daughter really beginning when we dissented from the Trump world. And so, it shocked us into this recognition that we long should have had. I mean, this is me saying, don't be like me, in the sense that it took the personal experience of my daughter to really shock me awake about those kinds of issues. And that shouldn't have happened. I should have been able to listen to people before, right? It shouldn't have taken that personal experience. But we human beings are tough to educate without experience. It's tough for us to learn things without experiencing them. And it's to my shame that I didn't. And and then when the other thing is, as we began to see a lot of controversial police shootings, I really began to dive into it. And especially in light of my own experience in Iraq, where we were in a far, far, far more dangerous place than your median American city. I mean, infinitely more dangerous, and yet often exercise more discipline in with our weapons than I've seen police exercise in the streets of America. Now, that's not most police. Most police are not like that. Most police are disciplined, restrained, professional, and I truly, from the bottom of my heart, deeply appreciate them. But there are people who are not, and they are shielded and protected by a layer of laws and a cultural deference to the police that I think is highly inappropriate and leads to exactly the kinds of situations we've seen play out in the streets of Minneapolis. But at the core level, I would make the argument that I didn't leave the party left me. And it left me both from a standpoint of ideology, and it left me from a standpoint of emphasis on character, because my understanding of what it meant to be a conservative and a Republican prior to the Trump years is that you had sort of two things happening at once. One was conservatives were going to be a bit more reflexively skeptical of government solutions, especially to complex social problems. But at the same time, if you're going to have that skepticism, you're also going to put a very high premium on personal responsibility and personal character, including in leaders. And Republicans often look down on the Democrats for the moral compromises in the Clinton era. And we said, we wouldn't never advance somebody like that. Well, be careful what you say. Be careful what you say. And so in that sense, the party left on the emphasis on character. Now, if you look at this administration, character is an impediment to joining this administration. Like, if you have a high character, don't apply, because you're going to find yourself immediately in a situation where you're going to face a choice between doing the right thing and keeping your job. And so you lost that character element, and then you lost the ideological element. I mean, I tell my MAGA friends, you know me for years. Which Trump position am I supposed to like? Blowing up NATO, violating civil liberties in the streets of Minneapolis, massive deficit spending? Which of those things am I supposed to get on board with?
David, the diagnosis of the rot right? And the way that what should have been, or what we might have expected to be, a solid set of conservative positions sort of collapsed under Trumpism. I think we've given a pretty extensive, maybe not complete, but extensive diagnosis of that. So I'm wondering if we can pivot to talk about what would a healthy Christianity under these conditions look like, and how might we begin to recover one? I mean, this is not to say that there aren't healthy Christians currently, but a publicly healthy Christianity that people can recognize. So I'm thinking of two things you wrote recently in particular. Back in I think it was November, you writing about Pope Leo, you said somewhere in that piece that Trumpism is a religious phenomenon and requires a religious answer. And then you wrote a really evocative piece, a piece that I read several times just before Christmas, about Christianity as a dangerous religion and the upside down faith of the kingdom of God. So the question I want to ask is, like the stuff that is so challenging and counterintuitive about Christianity, the incarnational heart of the religion, of Jesus coming to be human and coming to be vulnerable as a human, and then the ethic of enemy love that we're called to as Christians. Where do you see any hope for that to start to reemerge, and how that can become more the public face of Christianity, so that a healthy Christianity can emerge on the public stage and compete for attention with everything else?
Well, I absolutely see hope for it to reemerge. Absolutely. And first, for a few reasons. First, there's absolutely a remnant of Christians engaged in the public square who really are keeping their eye on the ball of love God, love your neighbor as just the core ethos. You really are seeing a virtuous Christian response to malice and cruelty arising. Now, it's kind of diffuse. It's not coming from, predominantly any one strain of American Christianity, but it's there. It's real. And I see dissenters in the evangelical church. I see them in the Catholic church. And then also, another thing that I think is really important is we actually have a person who is modeling, I believe, what it means to engage in the public square as a Christian, and that person is Pope Leo. And I say this as an evangelical Protestant, that if I'm going to look at a person, a single public figure in the world, that I would say, okay, here is what I aspire. Here is a human being who is a model of what I aspire to. It would be the way he is approaching this moment. And so I think, anytime you have an, an idea that is not just an idea, but it's an embodied idea, then you've got hope. You've got a model. You've got role models. Guys, we're in a weird state of religious flux and realignment in this country. I have seen all kinds of cross pollination. I have seen evangelicals becoming more Catholic. I've seen Catholics becoming more evangelical. I've seen people drifting back into the main line. There's just a lot of moving and sorting right now. But I will tell you, I have hope, because I think that we actually have a person, and one of arguably now the most prominent American in the world, along with Donald Trump, as a model. And then the other thing, I think we are also increasingly seeing a blueprint. So not just a model, but also kind of a blueprint from the standpoint of, for a long time, Christian political engagement was focused almost exclusively over policy. Okay, what tax rate? Do you go to war or do you not go to war? Do you like these big policy issues? And almost no attention was paid to virtue. Almost no attention was paid to, okay, how do we interact in the public square? And so what became obvious is that it's almost as if, if you're reading scripture, and Galatians 5 talks about the fruit of the Spirit: kindness, gentleness, peace, joy, patience, self-control, all of these virtues, you would almost have a little asterisk that would say, well, except in politics. And then if you exhibit these virtues, you might lose. Or, if you go back to the Old Testament in Micah 6:8, what's required of you, O man? What is good? It is to act justly. It is to love mercy, and it is to walk humbly with the Lord your God. And then there's this little asterisk: except mercy, kindness, and humility, not in politics, you might lose. And so what you began to see with this incredibly policy first, aggressive, angry Christian engagement in the public square that bore no resemblance to the way Jesus conducted himself and bore no resemblance to Paul's many admonitions about how we're to engage with people. And so, what I'm beginning to see is a movement of Christians who are saying, how can we love our neighbors, not just by saying, my policies are my kindness, but how can we love our neighbors while we're advocating our policy? How can we be kind and generous and sacrificial and forgiving and full of grace to people with whom we have profound disagreements? And I can guarantee you that is the witness that will shine like a light in the darkness right now, given the amount of hatred we have.
That really resonates, because as I've done some self-examination on this, thinking about the places where I get angry and reactive and sharp in political disagreement with fellow Christians. One of the things I see there is, on the one hand, one of the motives for me is the fear that the policy that I think is so important won't win out. And what that ultimately translates to is a lack of confidence that God will actually providentially govern the world, right? That it is ultimately God who is in whose care we are, rather than us getting a checklist of everything right. But I think the other thing that I've realized, the fear that's in me there, is that if I do actually follow the counsel of Micah, or follow the counsel of Paul, and act with this gentleness and humility, I'm going to get hurt. And it's, as a Christian, it's like, well, surprise, Jesus got hurt, right? That is one of the sort of obvious outcomes of acting that way. But for a Christian, if our trust is really in God, that doesn't invalidate it, right? In fact, that is what makes it holy. That call back to virtue is so important, but it has to be paired with the reward for this virtue, or the way it's going to win, the way this virtue is going to be successful, is not in the eyes of the world, but in God's time and in God's hands.
Yes. And again, Jesus here is the model. I mean, from the Christian nationalist point of view, Jesus' ministry was a failure. I mean, he came to earth, he died on a cross, he was resurrected, and he ascended, and there wasn't a single policy change in the Roman Empire. I mean, it was still there. It was still oppressing Israel when he ascended. And when you put it in that perspective, because one of the reasons why he was crucified, because he wasn't a revolutionary leader. The crowd wanted Barabbas, an insurrectionist. So they went insurrection over Jesus. They wanted, and in fact, after Jesus was on this earth and after his resurrection and ascension, there was an insurrection. It was an incredibly bloody insurrection in Palestine at that time. And so, from that standpoint, so much of Christian politics takes such a short range view. It says, well, you have to measure your Christian engagement by your wins. How did you win? What policy victories did you have? And I can imagine Jesus walking to the room and saying, okay, you might be mad that I didn't do much about Caesar, but I killed death. I defeated death. Okay. So Caesar is a trivia question at this point. Caesar is a trivia question, and Jesus is alive, and Jesus is providing hope, eternal hope, to billions today. And when you look at it that way, it's like, okay, Jesus was not going to major in the minors when he was on earth. He was going to major in the majors, and that was defeating death and hell and loving his neighbor. And so when you put it in that perspective, this sort of look, I'm very aware that I'm going to come across to some people as a hypocrite because I'm a political writer. So a lot of my writing is about politics. But where we take our Christian engagement and our Christian witness and bring it so politics forward, which is not to say that we should not be engaged in politics. I mean, one of the most virtuous movements in American history is the civil rights movement. And that was a Christian movement, not exclusively Christian, but it was at its core a Christian movement. Abolitionism at its core a Christian movement. So it's not that you are forsaking those politics, it's that you are fitting them in within the prism of the upside down kingdom of God that always keeps the main thing the main thing. And as you said, one of the most comforting elements of all of this is that it ultimately doesn't depend on us. We serve a sovereign God who has told us how all this works out. And it works out beautifully in the gospel. It works out beautifully. And so we should approach the world with hope and faith and not fear and anger.
If I may, David, going back to what you were saying about Pope Leo, just because as a Catholic, it's kind of fascinating to see how he's perceived outside the world of Catholicism and in evangelical circles. When he was elected, obviously the Cardinals didn't elect him because he was an American, but the fact that he is an American, a lot of the commentary was like, okay, he's maybe going to be more effective than Pope Francis because people can't discount his commentary as out of touch or just ignorant of the American experience. So you mentioned him being a figure of hope for you. So in light of that, in light of, policy outcomes not necessarily being the goal, what do you see specifically from Leo that American Christians should be paying attention to in terms of his interventions in U.S. politics?
What I see about from Pope Leo that I value so much, that I treasure so much, is merciful orthodoxy, is gracious orthodoxy. And I feel like we almost get in this weird world where we say you can be kind and gracious, or you can be orthodox.
Mm-hmm.
Like these are the kind of in competing with each other, that somehow upholding church teaching and the spectrum of church teaching is incompatible with loving your neighbor, because there's elements of church teaching that call you to a level of righteousness and a level of purity and chastity and things like that are very much out of step with sort of the way the world views many of those values. But at the same time, having following that high call does not mean being angry and bitter at the world or feeling that we have to dominate it to get our way. That high calling also comes along of that holiness and chastity and all of those things. That high calling also comes along with the high calling of abundant love for neighbor. And that's what I see in him that I think is so compelling. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what does a virtuous Christian politics look like? What is virtuous Christian politics? And I just keep going back to the civil rights movement. And the model of the civil rights movement was that they were going to advocate for justice in a way that no one could mistake their courage, but also in a way that no one could mistake their love. So that was the core element of the philosophy of nonviolence, is we're going to stand for courage at the same time that we love our neighbors by eagerly forgiving people, by engaging in peaceful civil disobedience where we comply with even unjust laws. If an unjust law is imposed on us, that's the part of civil disobedience, is you break an unjust law and then comply with the consequences. As my co-host of Advisory Opinions, the legal podcast that I do, Sarah Itzker, said, there's a reason it's called Letters from a Birmingham Jail and not Letters from a Birmingham Starbucks. And then if you read, what is wonderful, if you read some of the commitment cards that civil rights activists were asked to read and sign and agree to, it has astonishing statements in there, like our goal is reconciliation, not victory. So in other words, they were looking not just for a political victory, but they were looking at a union of hearts, that they were looking for the softening of hearts. And so when I think of how to do politics as a Christian, I don't think I have to reinvent the wheel at all. I can say, even in the darkest of times, even when injustice is at its maximum, look at King, look at the civil rights movement. This is how you advocate for justice and love your neighbor at the exact same time. And it's sad. I think part of this is a legacy of so much of Southern evangelicalism was on the absolute wrong side of the civil rights movement. So they didn't exactly grow up thinking of the civil rights movement as our movement, even though it was very Christian, even though it was shot through with gospel love and truth. And I feel like these later generations of Christians need to have a paradigm shift. They need to say, look, just as I'm the I'm the descendant of Confederate veterans. But in reality, the Union Army was my army, right? As me living as a human American in the year 2026. And I feel like if you're an evangelical, if you're a Christian living in the year 2026, in truth, if you're a Christian, the civil rights movement, look at it as we should be thankful and proud that our, forefathers and mothers in the faith, because it is a shared faith, did this, and see it as a model that any Christian, not just the Black church, not just the progressive church, a model that any Christian could follow.
So, David, when I think about where I actually see something like this happening, or at least where I see the seed of it today, and you'll pardon me that these are going to be some Catholic specific references because that's where I spend
Sure.
most of my time, of course. But I think of the people marching in Chicago, where you are right now, to go and try to bring the Eucharist to detainees, knowing that they would provoke a confrontation there, but doing so in real hope, right? Like what they actually wanted was to be let in, not, and the confrontation was going to come, but was not the primary point. And I'm wondering, can you point to specifically on the immigration question, maybe some examples of where you see glimmers of hope for that that Christianity that prizes reconciliation above victory starting to shine through?
Okay, well, I will say I'm not seeing shining yet so much as I'm seeing like softening.
Okay.
And so it's a process. It's soften then shine. So, and what I'm seeing is, look, Trump came in, and if you were going to say that he had any mandate at all, you were going to say he had two. One was to deal with inflation, and the other one was to deal with the border. And so he came in with the wind at his back on the border issue. And honestly, y'all, if he had closed the border to the extent that he has, and then engaged in a normal, humane deportation process that involved criminal immigrants, then I think he would be riding very high on that issue right now. But what he did instead was to close the border and then engage in a terrifying series of brutal, lawless, provocative raids that seemed designed to literally to terrify immigrants and to, quite frankly, terrify his opponents in blue cities and states. And so it's not just an immigration crackdown, it's a blue city crackdown. And and so what that has done is I'm now seeing the softening. He's gone from having big time support, one of the only issues where he had more than 50% support, to now he's deeply underwater on it. I'm seeing even some of the more not I'm not saying hardcore MAGA is fully, completely radicalized. They're calling for the Insurrection Act. But I'm seeing a lot of more normie Republicans really pushing back at this moment. And so I am seeing a softening. And then the other thing I'm seeing is something. Now, look, we should not sugarcoat too much everything that's happened opposing ICE. There has been violence that's utterly unacceptable. But by and large, what I'm seeing are neighbors supporting neighbors, neighbors loving neighbors, and really an enormous amount of community connection, especially in Minneapolis. I have colleagues who've reported on the ground. I have friends who've been on the ground, and they said, you will not believe the community response, the community connection. And honestly, it's turning the tide. It really is turning the tide. And so that gives me hope. Part of the thing that also gives me hope is the MAGA Christian voices are doubling and tripling down so much on their harsh rhetoric that it makes me feel like they're not feeling confident. When MAGA feels threatened, it doesn't try to persuade, it tries to bully. And I'm seeing a lot of bullying online. And I'm not sure how much longer that's going to last. And how much longer that's going to be. Well, I know how long it'll last. They'll keep doing it, but I don't know how much longer it will be effective. And I do think that there are real signs of softening, not not revival, so to speak, but like people are asking questions. They're raising their eyebrows. They're worried, And I think that's ideal, the ideal time when you can come in. You don't have to go to the other extreme. You can just say, look, there we we can have a border and we can enforce immigration laws in a way that respects humanity and dignity. It's not that difficult. It's been done. It's been done. Right before Trump came into office, people asked me, what can we do? What can we do? And I said, my two main pieces of advice are speak the truth and defend the vulnerable. And I'm seeing a lot of that in this immigration context. They're speaking the truth about the virtue of our immigrant communities, and they're defending them from lawless aggression. And I think that that combination, continue to tell the truth about the virtue of our immigrant communities and defend them from lawless aggression, that's the path.
Well, we're talking, I guess, 3 weeks now after the killing of Renee Good, less than a week after the killing of Alex Preddy. And as Sam mentioned at the beginning, it does feel like a turning point. And I don't know, I've been connecting this to what you were saying about your wake up call on race relations. The fact that these were two white American citizens, and that's what's kind of making this softening among MAGA come about. I mean, if that's what it takes, I guess I'll take it. But it's such a tragic situation, and both Sam and David may be putting on your civil liberties lawyer hat, or your evangelical hat. How are you responding to those specific events, which seemed like a crossing into the Rubicon?
Well, I can jump in. I've hoped for the Rubicon so many times over the course of the past however many years that I'm very cautious about hoping for it now. I will say, in a specifically Catholic context, I have been encouraged to see. I think we're seeing bishops speaking up and speaking on behalf of the Catholic community in clearer ways. That's been happening since their immigration message, but I think it's the snowball is continuing to pick up snow. So I'm grateful for that. But really, I think the hope is, as David said, the basic decency of people looking at this, realizing that they're being lied to by the administration, and saying, no, this does not represent us. We do not consent to it. We're not going to simply stand by and let it continue to happen. But I think one of the challenges there, and one of the things that will have to be well integrated by people who have been, opposing the excesses of the Trump administration for a while now, is when people change their minds, that reconciliation more than victory, that not, human beings, we are not so constituted, most of us, that we can do a full, right down to the bottom repentance of everything we've done wrong all in one move. So we need room for people to moderate. We need room for people to be able to move to, this was crazy and excessive and awful, and we can do slightly better than that, and we should take slightly better and not demand perfect all at once.
On Instagram, I'm seeing these everyone is posting the same message. It's basically like, you can jump off this train at any time.
At any time.
Yeah.
And I think the message, I love what you just said, because I think the message has to be this: you can jump off at any time and we will welcome you. Mm-hmm. And, I've used this analogy before in my Christian tradition growing up. My church was very much a kind of a more fundamentalist church in many ways. And we always ended every Sunday with an altar call, and the altar call, come, and when somebody, especially somebody like, maybe had been somebody's kid or uncle or father or whatever that we'd been praying for a long time, that they'd maybe been, strung out on drugs, or they had left church, or when they came forward, nobody was swatting them with a rolled up church bulletin saying, you should have done that 2 years ago, right? No, when the prodigal son comes home, what do? You run to meet them, right? And so this drives me nuts, with my longtime fellow never Trump conservatives. Sometimes you'll hear this, well, I got there 9 years ago, dude. What took you so? No, it is welcome friend. That's it. Welcome friend. And do not sit there and wait for somebody to comprehensively, completely repent. I am sure all of us have made serious mistakes in our lives that we have not fully either understood the consequences of nor fully repented of. So I believe in encouraging repentance and encouraging change, even at the most incremental level, because human beings crave community. And one of the things that happens is that when you turn from Trump, the way MAGA works is they will try to take your community. And so it is a very hard thing to face. And so if you cannot go from one community and find yourself loved and embraced in another one, you know what? You're not leaving. You're not leaving. And so I just cannot emphasize your point enough. If somebody is opening their minds and opening their hearts, don't swat them with the church bulletin. Put your arm around them and say, welcome, friend.
And it's a unified vision as well, because it's presenting the face of mercy, both in stepping up to protect the vulnerable who are being assaulted and terrorized, and also presenting the face of mercy in meeting those who are willing to begin stepping away from the terror.
Absolutely. It should be mercy radiating all around, including towards even the most bitter opponents as they hopefully, Lord willing, by God's grace, start to open their minds and hearts.
All right. I think that's a good place to wrap up this conversation, except for one final question, David, that we ask all of our guests. And we'll ask you to be a little ecumenical in this process, which is if you
happy to be.
Could canonize one person, living or dead, Catholic or not, fictional or real, who would it be and why?
Okay, can I canonize a real person and a fictional person?
I'm guessing Lord of the Rings. Is that where we're going?
Okay, so I'm canonizing C.S. Lewis.
Okay.
I'm going to canonize C.S. Lewis. If it's funny, if people ask me like, what brand, what flavor of Christian are you? I'd say evangelical, but if I was going to get really nerdy in particular, I'd say I'm a C.S. Lewisical Christian. So it'd be C.S. Lewis would be the person I would canonize. And you nailed it. You nailed it on Lord of the Rings. I'd have to canonize Aragorn because the elves are, they're immortal already. And so, I'm going to canonize Aragorn. And
and what's his
any
role
other number of people.
For the non-nerds in our audience?
Yeah, who is Aragorn?
Yeah.
In the he is the king, the promised king who returns to the nation of Gondor and sets all things right, and is instrumental in defeating Sauron. One of the great characters in fiction, not just fantasy fiction, but in fiction, because it's very clear from the story that he's both good and he's human. He has doubts, he has fears, he doesn't know always the clear path, and yet he forges forward with incredible grace and courage. So I've got two: C.S. Lewis and Aragorn,
the virtuous and humble king. Yeah.
Yes.
All right.
Absolutely.
Anything you would like to plug before you go, David?
No, you can just, read my work at the New York Times. And also, if you are a law curious person, have I got the podcast for you? It's called Advisory Opinions. And I promise you, it's accessible. You can listen to it and you'll learn a lot about the law, and especially this moment, because constitutional law is more important right now than, quite frankly, any time in my adult lifetime.
All right. Thank you so much, David.
Thanks, David.
Thank you all. Very much appreciate it.
Jesuitical is made by us, Will Gualtieri, Kevin Christopher Robles, and Adam Buckmueller. Faith formation provided by Father Eric Sundrup, S.J. Don't forget to subscribe, follow, or like the show on your favorite platforms. You can support Jesuitical by subscribing to America Magazine at americamagazine.org. I'm Ashley McKinless. We'll see you next week.